Hey everyone, in this presentation I'm going to talk about the failure of the hedge fund long-term capital management. First I'll explain what is a hedge fund, then I'll make an overview of the case of LTCM. After that I will expose the violation of the CFA Code of Ethics and Standards, and finally I will make some recommendations. But first, what is a hedge fund and what are the characteristics of a hedge fund? It is a privately owned firm that raises money from large investors, including individuals, pension funds and charities, for the purpose of increasing the value of the investment. The hedge funds have been very popular from 1998 to 2008, and at a point in 2008 they were managing 1.6 trillion worth of assets, so this is huge. One characteristic of a hedge fund is that they are not very much regulated. As a consequence, it is very hard even for the investors to get information about their strategies or their earnings. It means a hedge fund has a sort of unlimited freedom to design its strategies and their investments, and those investments can include any kind of product. Another characteristic is that these funds are asking very huge fees, and usually the formula is 2 and 20. It means the fees represent annually 2% of the value of the invested money. But that's not the end. They also retain 20% of any profit. Sometimes the formula can even be 3 and 30. Then when an investor invests some money in a hedge fund, there is a lockup. It means the investor cannot take back its money whenever he wants. Moreover, a hedge fund is allowed to borrow money to invest it. This is called leverage, and it is a very powerful tool to increase the returns, but also it's a very powerful way to lose everything if something goes wrong. A final important characteristic is that fund managers are taxed at the capital gains rate of 15% is instead of 35% of income taxation. And this is one more reason why the hedge funds managers make huge amount of money. Okay, so now let's move on to the LTCM case overview. So this graph is just for you to have an idea of what we are talking about. In yellow you see the performance of the fund between 1994 and 1998. So first I'll explain how LTCM was born. As you all know, the golden rule in finance is that the money you make depends on the risk you take. At some point in the middle of the 20th century, there was a scientific project which aimed to find a mathematic way to break this basic rule of a financial market. A model came up, and this model was able to hedge the risk through the use of options. The only missing key to be able to use this model was the pricing of the options. So Professor Myron Scholes and his colleague Fisher Black found a way of pricing the options, and Professor Robert Merton adapted to continuous time. This model has been accepted on the trading floor right away and allowed traders to make a lot of money. In the meantime, together with John Merriweather, they decided to launch a giant hedge fund called long-term capital management, with the promise to use mathematic formula to get rid of the risk. Their reputation made it easy to raise $1.3 billion from all kinds of prestigious investors. Investors had to pay $10 million to get into the fund, and they were not allowed to take the money out for 3 years or even ask about the types of investment LTCM used. So the goal of the fund was to profit from the combination of the academic's quantitative model and the trader's market judgment and execution capabilities. All aspects of this enterprise made it looks like perfect and destined for success. The first 3 years, their return was 20%, 43%, and 41%. In 1997, they even received the Nobel Prize. One fact is to be noticed. In the beginning of 1998, the fund decided to return about 2.7 billion of the capital to investors because the investment opportunities were not large and attractive enough. In the meantime, in 1998, slowly the market dynamic changed with the collapse of property pricing in Asia, followed by the Russian default. Actually, the model was built for normal market conditions and it began to show some strange results. Nevertheless, the model told them that the situation would return to normal soon and they kept on relying in it. In the meantime, the price of options was rising dramatically and they had to borrow heavily. In fact, the principle of a hedge fund is to invest in products that are decorrelated, but when huge events occur on the market, it can happen that everything that was not correlated before became correlated. So 4 days after the Russian default in August 1998, the hedge fund had lost $500 million in 1 day and they went bankrupt. As the fund was too big to fail, the Fed had to intervene to organize a bailout of $3.5 billion to avoid a systematic crisis in the world financial system. So now let's move on to the ethical breaches of this case. First, let's talk about standard number 3, loyalty, prudence and care. In this case, it seems to me that this standard is violated for several reasons. First, in regard to loyalty to clients, the managers of LTCM clearly didn't take risk into account as they were thinking to be hedged against it. According to me, this is a violation of the exercise of prudent judgment. Moreover, we could wonder if the goal was really to benefit to the clients. To me, it looks more to be like a trial to try their model. When the model has shown its capacities after the first 3 years, LTCM gave some revenue back to the investors and largely invested their own money instead. I think that the reason for that could be greed. They demonstrated that the model worked and then didn't want to share anymore. In the meantime, this also confirms the fact that they were truly confident about their strategy. More generally, in the case of a hedge fund, investors don't know where their money goes, so the funds do not disclose about their strategies, and it means that the clients have no information about their accounts. This absence of transparency can create an incentive to separate interests of the fund and interests of the client. Let's now move on to suitability. Clearly, the individual clients of LTCM were healthy, but I believe that reasonable inquiry related to clients' investment experience was not conducted. As the fund didn't disclose its strategy, it seems that they could benefit from naive clients. However, we must not forget that most of their clients were big investors completely capable of assessing their risks. Nowadays, individuals are more and more exposed to hedge funds, and this exposure can be direct or indirect. In the latter, the client can be exposed through pension funds, for example. I believe that the investment done by a hedge fund is not suitable regarding those clients. A pension should not rely on a dangerous investment. Now a few words about performance presentation. In our case, even if the performance was disclosed, it was not explained as the strategy was kept secret. We are facing a real issue of information asymmetry. In general, it is very easy for a hedge fund to hide bad performance to clients for a while because of the absence of regulation about disclosures and explanations. As I said before, this absence of transparency can create an incentive to separate interests of the fund and interests of the client. The common knowledge about hedge funds is that they perform better than the market, but in fact, since 2000, the average hedge fund does not appear to have done better after fees than the market as a whole. So, according to me, this poor knowledge is due to a lack of performance presentation. Let's now move on to standard number 5. First, regarding diligence and reasonable basis. The issue here is that they clearly relied too much on a model without using their own judgment enough. So they followed a model based on normal financial conditions, but the conditions at that time were not normal anymore. So in fact, the model was too far from human judgment. Now about communication. Again, here there was no communication about the strategy followed by the fund managers. So there were no disclosures at all about the process used to analyze the investments, and the lack of communication is thus very clear. Let's now have a few words about other common ethical issues related to hedge funds. For example, hedge funds which revenues are already higher than a classical investment fund are paying much less taxes than their counterpart, as their remunerations are taxed as capital gains and not as income. According to me, this is a violation of tax fairness, which is like should be taxed alike. Finally, due to their huge leverage power, hedge funds can be damaging for the economy if they fail. In our case, the Fed must bail out the fund to avoid a systemic crisis. Let's now make a few recommendations about this case. First, about stress testing. We learned from this case that a model, even if it was built by Nobel Prize owners, need to be stress tested. It means it should be not only tested for normal market conditions, but also in the case of an unexpected event. Then, we should not underestimate human judgment. The owners of the fund were mostly scientifics who did not believe that the trader instinct existed. In fact, they believed that the market functioning was beyond this human instinct, and that's why they wanted to build a model and to model it. I think that at some point in 1998 they forgot to think as human and they relied too much on the model. Moreover, I think that we should limit the exposure to the public. Indeed, I believe that non-qualified investors should not be exposed to hedge funds, or at least they should be warned about the risks they take. This should include information campaign focusing on individual investors. Now let's have a final word about transparency. Hedge funds are part of what is called shadow banking, and that means the risks cannot be evaluated and managed because they are not known. This shadow banking thus represents a risk for the financial stability. It seems to me that it is crucial to have more transparency regarding the hedge funds, and I truly believe this transparency have to be imposed by an authority. All the recommendations I made should be linked with a stronger regulation. Unfortunately, regulations of the hedge funds is a very touchy issue because it is essential, but it seems to be very hard to implement. It requires international cooperation, which is always hard to reach. Okay, so this is the end of this presentation about the case LTCM. I hope it helped you to understand the case and the ethical issues related to it. I thank you a lot for your attention.